So good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar tonight. And we're just going to let the room fill up a little bit, and then we'll get going. We're excited to have you all here tonight. I'm joined by Dr. Ira Helfand and Elaine Scarry, and my colleague at Coalition for Peace Action in Princeton, Nikki Van Arl. And we'll just let it build a minute. Okay. People will keep streaming in, but we're going to get going. Good evening. I am Jeff Hoey, Executive Director of New Jersey Peace Action. I want to welcome everyone here tonight and thank you all for being here. Thank you very much for Coalition for Peace Action in Princeton for co-hosting and for being a great partner in putting this webinar together. Welcome to Nikki Van Arl, Assistant Director for Coalition for Peace Action, who you will hear about a little later. I want to get quickly to our panel tonight, but some quick notes. Please reserve the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen for questions to our panelists and the topics being covered tonight, and be as concise as you can. We're going to reserve the last 20 minutes or so for the Q&A period and get to as many questions as we can. Attendees will be muted during the webinar. We are streaming this live on Facebook, and we'll also post a recording of tonight's discussion on our YouTube channel within a day or two. So to get going, 75 years after their use in Japan, nuclear weapons remain an existential threat to all life on the planet. Just 9 nations hold the almost 200 countries hostage with these weapons of mass destruction. Over 14,000 nuclear weapons still exist in arsenals in the 9 nations that hold them, with Russia and the United States holding over 90% of them. However, and you'll hear more about this, it will take only a very small exchange between even 2 less nuclear powers, let's say India and Pakistan, to change life for all of us as we know it and to kill millions on Earth. It's time to end this threat. We'll discuss all of this in the next hour. Importantly, there are things all of us can do about this threat, and we'll talk about specific steps we can all take before we leave tonight. Tonight, we're joined by 2 experts in the field, and they will talk about the dangers and what is being done to a certain extent to mitigate those dangers. We're joined by Elaine Scarry, who is Professor of English and American Literature and Language at Harvard University. Her books include The Body in Pain, On Beauty and Being Just, Dreaming by the Book, and Thermonuclear Monarchy, Choosing Between Democracy and Doom, in which she explores the baleful political consequences of limiting the control of nuclear weapons to a select few and the authority to launch them to even fewer, in the case of the United States, to the president alone and what amounts to his monarchical power. And now we'll start with Dr. Ira Helfand. Ira is a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which is the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize, and co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the founding partner of ICAN, and itself the recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. He is also co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, IPPNW's US affiliate. Ira, I'm going to throw it over to you for your remarks. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I'll be back in a little while when Ira's finishing up. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff. And thank you all for coming tonight. Up here in Western Massachusetts, where I live, it's turned into a beautiful evening. And I'm sure all of you understand that we're not going to be talking about easy or pleasant things in the next hour. And I sometimes feel really guilty about presenting the information I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes to you all. But I've really come to believe very firmly that we have 2 choices. We either talk about nuclear war and do something to prevent it, or we're going to have one, which is going to be a whole lot less pleasant even than what we're going to go through this evening. we are living this year through an extraordinarily difficult time. We're dealing with the worst epidemic in 100 years, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, painful evidence of the ongoing prevalence of racial injustice in a horrifying degree here in the United States. And all of these problems are being made worse by the inappropriate behavior of the Trump administration. And they all demand our attention because the government's not working to fix them. So somebody has to, and that means us. And we need to do that. But I think we also need to be very careful during this very difficult time not to lose sight of the two great existential threats which loom over all of us and which also require our attention. And they are the climate crisis and, as Jeff said just a minute or two ago, the threat posed by nuclear weapons. As we approach the Hiroshima-Nagasaki anniversary, it's particularly important, I think, for us to focus on the nuclear problem. And a generation ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago actually, in the 1980s, we all understood the danger posed by these weapons. And millions of people in North America, in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in Japan, Australia, took political action to end the Cold War arms race and to try to prevent nuclear war. The problem that we deal with today is the fact that when the Cold War ended, we all started to act as if the problem of nuclear war went away. But as Jeff just reminded us, there are still 14,000 nuclear warheads in the world. The problem never went away. And in recent years, it has become much worse. The danger has become much greater. And we are having a lot of difficulty getting our arms around that. It's a very fundamental problem, I think, of human psychology. We cannot, any of us, believe that this wonderful world that we live in can be blown apart in an afternoon. We may even know it intellectually, but we can't believe that it could happen. And it is critically important that we come to believe that it can happen, because unless we understand this danger, the enormity of it and the imminence of it, we are not going to take the action that we need to take to prevent it from actually happening. Now, there are a number of reasons why the nuclear danger has grown in the last few years. Several of them relate to geopolitical rivalries. US-Russian relations are the worst they've been in 30 years, worst since the end of the Cold War. Both countries are engaged in a nuclear arms race. They're modernizing and making more lethal their nuclear arsenals, and they are both engaging in nuclear saber rattling of a sort that we never thought we'd hear again when the Cold War ended. US-Chinese relations are the worst they've been in 40 years, and the economic rivalry between these two leading world economic powers now has a major military component as well. The US has just dispatched two aircraft carrier groups to the South China Sea in China's backyard, a very provocative action, and one which creates the possibility of a situation that escalates out of control in a military confrontation between US and Chinese naval forces. The situation with North Korea is well known to all of us. We had thought for a while that the danger was getting better. We have seen in recent months that nothing fundamentally has changed, and there remains a very great danger there in a very unstable situation. The political situation in the world that frightens me the most is the one that receives the least attention here in the United States, and that's the confrontation between India and Pakistan and South Asia. And these countries have fought for wars since they became independent in the 1940s. They came within hours of nuclear war on 2 occasions last year. Really were at the brink and were brought back from the brink through a combination of restraint and unexpected good behavior on the part of some of the political leaders in South Asia. It was a terribly frightening moment, which was largely ignored here in the United States, but they essentially had 2 Cuban Missile Crises in the last year, and they are primed for further problems because none of the underlying problems have really been addressed. In addition to these geopolitical crises, there are several other factors that are contributing to the current danger. One is climate change. And we don't necessarily think of climate change and nuclear war in this context, but we have been told for decades by the nuclear armed states that they are planning to get rid of their nuclear weapons at some point in the future when the world is safer. The problem is that climate change is making the world more dangerous, not safer. And as climate change progresses over the coming decades, and it will to some degree, no matter what we do at this time, large portions of this planet are going to be increasingly stressed in their ability to support their human populations. This is going to create enormous potential for conflict. And if nuclear weapons are still on the table as this scenario plays out, there is an increasing chance that they will be used. The other factor, which I think is particularly worthy of our attention, is the danger of cyber terrorism, which is growing. We used to think that the worst thing a terrorist group could do with regards to nuclear weapons would be to get hold of one or maybe two of these weapons and blow up a city like Washington or New York or Moscow, and it would be terrible. And this is still a danger, and it could still happen, and it will be terrible if it does. But we now understand that there is a far greater danger, which is that terrorist groups could carry out a cyber attack on the command and control centers of one or another of the nuclear weapon states, and either directly cause the launch of their nuclear weapons, or perhaps more likely, create a false alert, convince the country being hacked that it was under nuclear attack from one of its enemies, and induce that country to launch its nuclear weapons in response to this non-existent nuclear attack. This is an absolute nightmare scenario, and the cybersecurity people are terrified because they know that they don't know what the terrorists are up to, what hack they're going to try next. And we know that national security and Pentagon computer systems in this country are hacked into repeatedly every day. So this is a real and present danger, and made worse by the fact that we maintain about 1,000 of our nuclear warheads mounted on missiles that can be launched within minutes. They're in a hair trigger alert position, and that's one of the things that needs to change. So for all of these reasons, the nuclear danger has grown dramatically, and it is now at a point where people like former Secretary of Defense William Perry believe that we are closer to nuclear war today than we have ever been, even during the worst moments of the Cold War. This is an assessment that was echoed this past January by the panel of experts at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who moved the hands of their iconic doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight, the closest to nuclear Armageddon that it has ever been. And yet there's this disconnect. The experts are raising the alarm, and we, the people, aren't really hearing it. And that has to change. And that's part of our job, to educate people about the imminence of the danger that they face. We also need to understand the enormity of the danger. Let me talk for just a few minutes about what will happen if a nuclear war occurs. Again, back in the 80s, during the height of the Cold War, most people had a pretty clear idea of what nuclear war would mean. But 2 generations have grown up since then who have no personal experience of the Cold War, have never been taught about nuclear weapons, and really don't know very much about them at all. And then people of my age who did live through the Cold War have forgotten pretty much what we used to know about the danger and what would happen. So let me start, first of all, by talking very briefly about a limited nuclear war. Jeff alluded to this in his introduction. We used to think that only a massive war between the United States and Soviet Union would pose a threat to the whole planet. We now understand that even a very limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, involving less than 1% of the world's nuclear arsenals, could do the following. In the course of a week, it could kill 75 to 125 million people in South Asia due to the direct effects of the fires, the explosions, and the radiation released by these bombs. But beyond that, this war would loft an enormous amount of dust into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and causing worldwide climate disruption, large enough to put an enormous strain on food production across the planet, and large enough to lead to a global famine that would put up to 2 billion people at risk, not just in South Asia, but everywhere. Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, North America, Europe. The whole continent, the whole planet would be at risk in this famine. That's a limited nuclear war. Imagine a larger nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And we do need to consider that this could happen given the current state of affairs between the two countries. In a single afternoon, 300 to 500 million people could die from the explosions and the fires. And the soot put into the atmosphere by a war of this magnitude would cause climate change within a matter of days that would bring us back to conditions not seen since the last ice age. We would essentially create a man-made ice age in a matter of days. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, temperatures would fall 45 to 50 degrees. In the temperate zones of the Northern Hemisphere, there would be 3 years where there would not be a single day free of frost. The temperature would go below freezing at least some time every single day. And under those conditions, all of the ecosystems that have evolved since the last natural ice age would collapse. Food production would stop. The vast majority of the human race would starve to death. And it is possible that we would become extinct as a species. Now, what we need to understand is that this picture that I've just painted is not the plot of a grade B movie. This is the danger that we face every single day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. We know of at least 7 occasions during the nuclear weapons era when either Moscow or Washington began the process of launching the nuclear arsenal, always in the mistaken belief that they were under attack by the other side. And on each of these occasions, we were not saved because we had wise leaders or sound military doctrine or infallible technology. We were saved because, as Robert McNamara said, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And we have to understand that even if no nation makes a deliberate decision to launch these weapons, there is always the potential for an accidental nuclear war. Just this month, we lost Bruce Blair, an enormously wonderful human being and an incredibly important voice over the last decades in trying to alert the planet to the danger of accidental nuclear war and the danger of nuclear war in general. And it is a tremendous loss. And I think part of our charge, those of us who are friends of Bruce, is to carry on his work, alerting people to the imminence of this danger. Fortunately, this terrible vision is not the world that needs to be. There is no reason why we have to go down this path. Nuclear weapons are not some force of nature that's coming at us. It's not like there's an asteroid coming from outer space. These are little machines. They're smaller than the desk I'm sitting at. We have built them with our own hands. We know how to take them apart. We've already dismantled more than 50,000 of them. All that is lacking is the political will to dismantle the 14,000 that remain. And there are some very important initiatives that are taking place in the world today to change that. Internationally, there is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons and its effort to bring into effect the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which we can talk about a little bit more later. Here in the United States, there's the Back from the Brink campaign, which is a national effort to bring about the fundamental change in US nuclear policy needed to get us to a place where we commit to eliminating our nuclear arsenal in conjunction with the other nuclear armed states. It is a simple 5-point platform for what US nuclear policy ought to be, and the most important of the 5 planks in that platform is a call for the United States to enter now into negotiations with the other 8 nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to dismantle the remaining nuclear weapons in the world. The campaign also calls for the US to take 4 interim steps to lessen the danger as these negotiations proceed. We call on the United States to announce the first use of nuclear weapons, to take its weapons off hair trigger alert, to end the situation where the President of the United States has unchecked authority to launch nuclear weapons, and to abandon the plan to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years, enhancing every aspect of our nuclear arsenal. The model for this campaign is to get communities, civil society, faith groups, labor unions, professional associations, city councils, town meetings, state legislatures to endorse this platform and to create a national consensus that this is what our nuclear policy should be. The campaign has a website, www.preventnuclearwar.org. And I would urge all of you to visit the website. There'll be a new version of it launched in time for the Hiroshima anniversary, but the current website is also very helpful. Visit the website and figure out how you can be part of this campaign and how we can build on this. The stuff I've talked about tonight is, in some senses, very depressing. I am not a particularly depressed or sad person. I have great hope that we can avert this disaster. This is really in our hands, and we have the ability to save this planet, but we have to act. There's an enormous responsibility on our shoulders, and we have to deal with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ira. And as you mentioned, there has been progress, and we'll talk more about that, especially what's going on in the UN and efforts with the Back from the Brink campaign a little later during the Q&A period. So there is some reason for some optimism that the human race is finally maybe figuring this out. Elaine, so glad again to have you here with us. If you don't mind, why don't you give us your remarks, and then we'll go into a Q&A period and discuss this all with the attendees. Over to Elaine Scarry from Harvard University. Thanks again for being here, Elaine.
Pleasure to be here. And I share Ira's optimism that Back from the Brink may be able to bring about some real changes. The nuclear architecture is so vast that it's hard to grasp. I think it's helpful to recognize that it has two key features, two astonishing features. The first feature is the one that Ira mainly focused on, and that is the extraordinary level of injury that these weapons bring about. Ira mentioned the work of Alan Roebuck that shows that if even a tiny percentage of the nuclear arsenal is used, not 1%, but actually 0.03%, many millions of people will die, 44 million on the first afternoon, and huge escalating numbers as you go on through the days and reach a month where at least 1 billion people will be dead. And that level of injury is one that eliminates from all people on Earth the right of self-defense. If a weapon has the heat of the sun or even the multiple of the heat of the sun, there's no way that we can protect ourselves. So we have, as a species, lost the right of self-defense, which is actually the right underlying every other right. We care about something like free speech for thousands of reasons, but the bottom line reason is that it enables us to increase our chance of protecting ourselves, that is, perpetuating our aliveness. Nuclear weapons take away from us the right of self-defense. They also take away from us the right of mutual aid. The International Red Cross has said that if even a single city is hit, its worldwide resources won't be able to repair or help those who are still surviving and are terribly burned. So this is a terrible nightmare and obscene level of injury. And the second feature of nuclear weapons is that all that injury is brought about by a single person. Nuclear weapons are by design weapons to be launched by a single person. And we have in the United States a presidential first use policy. Our nuclear planners tend to favor first use of nuclear weapons. And it is something that people in the United States and all over the world have become especially alarmed about during the presidency of Donald Trump. But it's crucial to recognize that though there's a very good reason why people are terribly alarmed by this particular president, that every president stands in a hugely dangerous relationship to this arsenal. if Bruce Blair, whom we all mourn, were here, he would remind us of the timetable that the president is going to be making this decision in a matter of minutes, that he'll be briefed in about 30 seconds, according to Bruce, and then have maybe 6 minutes to make the decision. So in addition to the, I think obscenity is the right word, the obscenity of the fact that a single person can do this is the horrifying fact that he is being pressured just by the temporal arrangements. A sequence of presidents have considered a first strike. President Eisenhower considered a first strike in the Taiwan Straits in 1954. He again considered a first strike in Berlin in 1959. Robert McNamara, whom Ira referred to, tells us that President Kennedy 3 times came within a hair's breadth, that's McNamara's term, a hair's breadth of all-out nuclear war. We know that Nixon 4 times considered a first strike. He announced that to us. He didn't tell us which countries were involved, but we know that in one instance, North Korea was involved, and in another instance, Vietnam was involved. We also know that Lyndon Johnson considered a first strike against China in order to prevent China from itself getting a nuclear weapon. Now, in order to kind of get hold of these two, for me, it's helpful to remember that even a simple and singular weapon, such as a gun or a knife, has 2 ends. It has the end where the injury occurs, and it has the end where the injury is inflicted, where the agent inflicts the injury. And I've just been saying that nuclear weapons are astonishing for both ends. On this end, for the unthinkable magnitude of the injury that happens really literally within minutes. And at this end, remarkable for the miniaturization of the agency, that it's one person. And that's true in other nuclear states as well, that it's one person or 2 people or 3 people, but no relationship between the injury that's being inflicted and the authorization of it. This focus on the 2 ends is important for another reason, and that is because international law tends to focus on the illegality of the injury, and national law or constitutional law tends to focus on the illegality of the process for inflicting that injury. And we need desperately both international law and national law. We have to bring both of them to bear on this problem. So let me just elaborate each of the 2. International law involves ideas such as the fact that you can't have disproportionate suffering. You can't have a weapon that causes disproportionate suffering. That provision is part of the current treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that's being ratified. It's also present in other international protocols, such as the Geneva Protocols of 1925, 1949, and 1977. Another example is the idea that you can't have a weapon that trespasses over the boundary of neutral countries. And again, that's something that's in the current treaty for prohibiting nuclear weapons, and also in earlier protocols such as the 1907 Hague Convention. You can hear in both of those provisions a very overt, explicit moral content or ethical content, and that's again true of other provisions such as the 1948 UN Convention on the Prohibition and Prevention of Genocide, something that our country says it won't be guilty of even if it initiates a first use, as it did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I'm emphasizing the overt ethical content because when we turn to constitutional law or national law, the ethical content isn't quite as explicit. Please be assured that the ethical content is just as present. The deep moral impetus behind these procedures is the equivalent of the kind of ethical content of the international law, but it's framed in terms of procedural regulations. We are told that that constitutional law exists to address and constrain and outlaw outrageous kinds of injury, and that's done in a very technical way by requiring that a country cannot go to war. Our country cannot go to war unless and until there has been a congressional declaration of war. Today, that would mean that you had to engage an assembly of 535 people and persuade them that some other country had done something so egregious that not their leaders, but that their population, their no doubt wholly innocent population, deserves to have war inflicted on them. And there are certain pieces of legislation going through Congress right now, such as the Markey-Liu bill, which restricts first use unless the Congress has explicitly authorized the president to launch a weapon, and also the Warren-Smith bill, which explicitly prohibits any kind of first use under any circumstance. Since the invention of nuclear weapons, we have simply discarded these constitutional provisions, which is catastrophic. Thomas Paine said that the American Constitution is to governance as an alphabet is to language. And it's this that we've just thrown away because it's incompatible, it's wholly incompatible with nuclear weapons, and therefore, given the choice between a constitution or nuclear weapons, we've chosen or we've allowed our leaders or the nuclear personnel to put nuclear weapons in front of us and just discard the Constitution. This is not just a provision in the United States. It's one that you can find in the other nuclear states. For example, France has in its constitution Article 35, which again stipulates that it's Parliament who must oversee the country's entry into war. It's Parliament that must issue a declaration of war before that country begins to injure other people. India has a constitution with Article 246, which again says the Parliament is responsible for matters of war and peace, including issuing a declaration of war. You might think that Russia doesn't have such a provision because we think of it as being permissive of a very strong leader, though how you could ever have a leader given more power than we have in the United States is a mystery to me. But the Russian Constitution specifies that the president can act to defend the country up to its own borders, so it can defend the country internally and can't go beyond those borders unless the Federal Council, which is the equivalent of our Senate, has authorized it by issuing a declaration of war. We can notice that this same provision is turning up in these countries, and the fact that it is so is not a coincidence because those constitutions are coming out of centuries of social contract thinking, many centuries of social contract thinking, including, for example, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Hobbes said in his work on the social contract, the Leviathan, getting us out of the miserable condition of war is the reason you have a social contract. That's what a social contract is. So it follows from that the key provision of any constitution is the provision that oversees the country's entry into war. Justice Story in the 19th century called our requirement for a declaration of war the cornerstone of our Constitution, the cornerstone of it. Nuclear weapons are wholly incompatible with democracy, but also with any form of governance. And I want to just elaborate that for a couple of minutes. One way you can see that is by realizing that part of the reason you would have in any one of these countries a declaration before you begin to harm a foreign people is so that the idea can be tested that they deserve to be injured. And on the floor of Congress, in the 5 cases where we've had a declaration of war, which is the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War of 1846, the 1898 Spanish-American War, and World War I and World War II, the people in Congress consider themselves equal to one another. They debate one another. They contest what each other says. If someone says that this country over there is an enemy, for sure there will be someone who says, exactly what has that country done? And are you sure that some of our allies haven't done the same thing? And P.S., are you sure that we haven't done that thing? I'm making it sound very gentle, but these are ferocious debates that go on when people come up with the idea of suddenly trying to injure a foreign population. In the case of presidential first use, you have no such dissent. You have no such testing of the idea that you're going to injure a population. I had occasion to look at the discussions that Eisenhower had at the time that he was considering dropping an atomic bomb in the Taiwan Straits. And there's nothing that even approximates an act of dissent or questioning, except for one small moment where Secretary of the Treasury Humphrey says, aren't we going to have a hard time explaining to the American people why islands with names they don't know, like Quemoy and Matsu, were so important that we dropped an atomic weapon? Eisenhower immediately scolds him, tells him to just look at the maps on the wall and he'll understand the strategic importance of these islands. End of discussion, end of dissent. No one else steps forward to support Secretary of Treasury Humphrey. In 1959, Eisenhower has invited a couple of senators to be present during his discussions. And the reason for that is that in 54, he said repeatedly, you know, if I drop an atomic weapon, I'm going to be impeached because it's unconstitutional to do that, but I'm willing to be impeached. By 1959, he seems to have thought that maybe if he invites a senator or two, not 535 people, which is what should happen, but a senator or two, maybe that won't count as impeachable. And at a certain point, the very wise Senator Fulbright interrupts the proceedings and says, excuse me, I just want to understand what we're saying here. Are you saying that maybe the GDR will take out the bridges that go into West Berlin, and that, for example, we might then begin to repair the bridges, and that a GDR soldier might shoot a rifle at the repairman, and then we would drop an atomic weapon? And Eisenhower, rather than saying, Senator Fulbright, don't be preposterous, or of course not, or let me start over and try and be clearer, says, well, we're not exactly sure of the steps that will lead to the dropping of the atomic weapon. Another way that you can see the ethical content of these kind of procedures is to think about this, that if you ask people whether nuclear weapons are compatible with governance, they can usually give 2 or 3 reasons why they're utterly, radically out of line with any form of governance, no matter what form of governance that is. And Ira actually named 3 of them. One of them is the fact that nuclear architecture is subject to tremendous accidents. We know, for example, that the United States accidentally sent nuclear triggers for ICBMs to Taiwan when it was meant to be sending them helicopter batteries. We know that a French and British nuclear submarine, that is submarines carrying nuclear weapons, collided under the ocean. We know that Clinton lost the nuclear codes for a couple of months without telling the Pentagon that he had done so. But that susceptibility to accidents means that it's not completely under control, or very far from completely under control. The second way in which they're incompatible with governance, again mentioned by Ira, is the fact that people believe you can't unmake them. So, I mean, I agree with Ira, these are simple to unmake. We made them. We even know that you can, for example, dismantle the nuclear triggers in a matter of hours. And then other stages would be more complicated and take more time, but it can all be done. But people have come to persuade themselves that they can't be unmade. And therefore, as Bill Joy wrote in Wired magazine, they're the first example of kind of robot revolution, because for sure they can eliminate us. And we've come to believe that we cannot eliminate them. A third way in which they are ungovernable is that they are subject to appropriation by hackers or by terrorists or by non-state actors, that is, by illegal agents and who may be able to unleash some portion of this vast architecture, which could then lead to all-out nuclear war. Now, those three examples of the way in which nuclear weapons are ungovernable could mislead us into thinking that there's some lawful way, there's some lawful use if a duly elected president uses it. But in what way is it more lawful for a president or the prime minister of a country to issue a weapon that results in genocidal injury? There's no more argument on behalf of that than on behalf of the lone hacker or the lone terrorist. And in fact, all the lone terrorist or hacker did was appropriate this vast architecture that the states, the nation states, put in place. They are the ones who put in 10,000 steps, who have it ready to go. There's only one step left, and that is the presidential order to launch the nuclear weapon that our military is practicing for day and night. And as Bruce Blair makes us aware, the presidential launch order is the length of a tweet. Hobbes said that what is the worst thing that could ever happen in a nation? And he said the worst thing that could happen would be the massacre of its population. And he said that if that happens, it would be, it couldn't happen in a democracy, it couldn't happen in an aristocracy, it couldn't happen in an oligarchy. It could only happen where there was radical non-governance or an anarchy. So a just state is a state that makes its population care to be just. I think it's clear that the nuclear architecture and the nuclear state is a state that can't have a population that cares to be just. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I'm just going to get the other panelists back on screen here. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We do have some questions coming in from, there we go. We do have a number of questions coming in. Ira, do you mind, before we go to the other Q&As, giving us a brief update on the process in the UN on TPNW and where we stand in that process today? I know we had some good news over the last couple of weeks. You're muted. Maybe I can, here, just let's unmute you. There we go.
Am I unmuted now?
There you go.
Great, thanks. Yeah, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted at the UN in July of 2017 by a vote of 122 to 1. But in order to enter into force, it needs to be formally signed and ratified by 50 countries. And at this point, 82 or 83 countries have signed the treaty, and 40 now have ratified it, including Sudan, which was the most recent last week, I believe. And so we just need 10 more countries to ratify the treaty, and it will enter into force, and it will be it will define the possession of nuclear weapons to be a crime against humanity, and will, I think, correctly identify the 9 nuclear arms stations as the real rogue nations in the world. There's a very good chance that we will get the additional 10 ratifications in the coming months, and this treaty will enter into effect probably in January of next year. And it's a real landmark. It obviously only goes so far. The countries that have signed and joined the treaty do not include any of the nuclear armed states. But what they are doing is creating a new international norm that says nuclear weapons are not a badge of honor for a country, They are a marker which identifies their possessors as rogue states living outside of international law. And that's a very important and powerful statement that we can build on to create pressure within the nuclear armed states to actually get rid of their weapons.
Our first question is from Howard Lipoff, and it's for you, Ira. Can you discuss the 2 times over the past year you mentioned that India and Pakistan almost went to war? What happened, and how is nuclear war prevented?
So the first episode was in the spring of last year. You have to understand there's fighting between India and Pakistan on an almost daily basis in Kashmir across the line of demarcation, the de facto border between the 2 countries. It's usually very low grade, a few rifle shots, a few mortar rounds. Occasionally somebody gets killed on one side or the other. But there was an attack in the spring of last year in which a significant number, I think several score of Indian troops were killed. And in response to that, the Indian government, for the first time in more than 20 years, sent warplanes into Pakistani territory. And one of these planes was shot down and the pilot was captured. And it was an extraordinarily tense moment. And I think to the surprise of everyone, the Pakistanis just sort of turned the other cheek. They agreed to return the pilot and everybody kind of stood down. But it wasn't at all clear that was what was going to happen. And I think people who follow events there closely were really pleasantly surprised that the situation didn't escalate. The other near miss came later in the year when the Indian government imposed essentially martial law in the entire of Indian Kashmir. This is supposed to be an autonomous region, and Delhi took direct control and basically shut down the province. I mean, everybody was sort of locked in their houses. It was kind of like COVID before COVID. People couldn't go out for months. And this was just like a powder keg during this period of time. And it really, the situation has not changed enormously since then. The lockdown isn't as draconian as it was initially. But there's tremendous resentment to the Indian government in Kashmir, which has a majority Muslim population. And Pakistan finds itself wanting to support the population and being pushed to support the population in ways which bring the 2 countries really on a collision path. When martial law was imposed, no one knew exactly how the Pakistanis would react. Again, they chose to stand down and not escalate the situation. But one of the problems in this dynamic is that there are all kinds of players besides the central governments in India and Pakistan. Some of the close calls in the past have involved terrorist attacks that were launched by terrorist groups based in Pakistan against Indian forces. And it's still quite possible that in response to the ongoing situation in Kashmir, one of the several Pakistani terrorist-based groups will launch an attack on India that will set this whole situation in flames again.
Thank you, Ira. Our next question is from Don Leach, and it could be for either one of you or both that want to grab it. Removing nuclear weapons from the hair trigger status seems like it should be a no-brainer. What's the basis of resistance against this from lawmakers? And Elaine, Ira?
The resistance is not usually from lawmakers so much as it is from the executive branch. This is essentially an executive decision, and the President of the United States can take our forces off hair trigger alert. It's a relatively simple order to give. And in the closing months of the Obama administration, it was hoped that President Obama would take this step. And a lot of pressure was mounted to try to convince him to do this, but it failed. And this is a great mystery to me, why our government would want to maintain its weapons in this particularly dangerous and unstable way. During the Cold War, the rationale was we needed to be able to launch a nuclear war within minutes so that we wouldn't suffer a decapitating strike by the Soviets. We now have significant numbers of nuclear weapons at sea. If the Russians or the Chinese or somebody carried out a surprise attack on our land-based systems, the sea-based, submarine-based missiles are essentially invulnerable. And we have the ability to destroy the world using those weapons alone. If we decide we want to destroy the world, it doesn't have to be in 20 minutes. We can do it in a day. And I don't begin to understand, I think it's profoundly irrational, this cleavage to this idea that we need to have our weapons ready to go at a moment's notice. The closest I've ever gotten for an explanation was from a military person at a conference where I was sort of debating him, and I asked him that question, and he said, well, if we took our weapons off hair trigger alert and there was a crisis and we put them back on alert, that would destabilize the situation. And I mean, yeah, this is pretty bizarre thinking.
Elaine, this one was for you, if you want to field it. In Plato's Republic, the rulers had absolute knowledge, so were given absolute power. With nuclear weapons, our leaders have absolute power, but they do not have absolute knowledge. Interesting. That is a dangerous mismatch. Can we use this point to support our cause? Interesting question.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question and a wonderful formulation. I think that a kind of good visualization of that comes from the way in which we communicate with the nuclear submarines. We have 14 Ohio-class submarines. Each carries the equivalent of 4,000 Hiroshima bombs. We're currently making 12 new nuclear submarines. They'll be called Columbus-class rather than Ohio-class. And in order to communicate with them, we relied on a system of extremely low frequency waves, or what was called the ELF system, with a huge antenna in Michigan and Wisconsin. And it takes this antenna 15 minutes to communicate 3 letters of the alphabet to a deeply submerged submarine. And so it's a kind of example of incredible illiteracy. If, for example, you wanted to retract an order or something, you have only this very unwieldy system. And it's the equivalent of, let's say you had a medieval village and you had 2 villages on a mountainside, and their only way of communicating was to try and flash matchlight across a vast distance. That way of communicating with the deep submarines was dismantled in about 2004. It was another illustration of the fact that it's a first use system. And the military has so far not said how, what they've replaced it with. So it's like this thing that is as, forgive the word, as colossal in its stupidity as it is sophisticated in its ability to deliver horrifying levels of injury. They're inversely related. You know, there's a famous playwright, Harold Pinter, and after he died, his wife, Antonia Fraser, found in his drawer a little play he'd written that was just about a page long, where the President of the United States picks up the phone, this is before Trump, picks up the phone and orders a launch against London, believing that it's the capital of France. And then when he realizes he's made the mistake, he then attacks France. But that kind of geography mistake and the huge discrepancy between the amount of knowledge you can have. I mean, how much knowledge would you need to have to ever justify killing 100 million people?
Thank you to our friend Charles Courtney for that. And thanks for that great answer, Elaine. My colleague, Nikki, I was wondering if you could take a few minutes and at this point, before we go a little late, we may run a little over. I don't know if our panelists are available to run a little over. I don't know if you have any time. We've had quite a few questions, and I could do them via email after the event, certainly, and we probably will not get to all of them. If you can stay for just a few minutes, great. If not, we understand that you might need to leave. But there's quite a few questions. But I wanted to give Nikki a few minutes. We always want to leave these webinars with what can we do about the situation. So I'll let Nikki speak for a few minutes. I may get involved in this as well. Nikki, thank you.
Sure. Thanks. So let me pull this up. Yeah, so it can be very, very frustrating and hopeless to think about such a huge issue and wrap our minds around it, even if we've been doing this advocacy work for a while. But like you said, we want to talk about what we actually can do, what regular people can do. One thing that's huge is education. I know, like, I have a bachelor's degree in political science, and I can remember like one time that any class I was in covered anything to do with nuclear weapons. So one opportunity for ourselves and others to get educated is upcoming Hiroshima and Nagasaki events commemorating the 75th anniversary of those bombings. There's a lot of stuff happening around this time. I know the Coalition for Peace Action has a commemoration by Zoom on August 9th. Jeff, are you guys doing something on the 8th, right?
Yeah, we have a number of different events. Actually, some of them we're just piggybacking on other groups, and then we also have something on the 9th, yes.
Nice, great. Yeah, so there's so many things to find. And it's important for us to like also remember why this matters so much. So even if you can't make it to ours, just look for something you can attend and just stay tuned in general to what nuclear weapons issue groups are doing. Find a group you can be connected to and get involved in. My email and Jeff's email are up here, so feel free to take that down and get in touch to see how you can support us. One way you can support us is by spreading the message and support the message that way. So forwarding our email alerts that you can sign up for, or I've put the our social media handles up here as well. And then finally, I will emphasize that we want to see Congress move towards prioritizing human needs and not nukes, but they're only going to do that if they hear from us about it. So we will follow up with specific messaging and contact information for phone calls and emails to elected officials. One thing that we're supporting here is the SANE Act, which focuses on funding the unbelievable amount of money that we could be using to make people's lives better. So like I said, we'll follow up with more information. Jeff, did you want to talk about Back to the Brink?
Yeah, I'll just take a quick minute and just let people know. So New Jersey Peace Action, Ira spoke about this campaign and was instrumental in putting it together. There is a campaign in the United States on Back from the Brink, and we are trying to get faith groups and other organizations to endorse the goals, which are listed here on the slide: renouncing the option of using nuclear weapons first, ending the sole unchecked authority of the president that Elaine spoke out so eloquently about, taking U.S. nukes off hair trigger, canceling the plan to replace the entire arsenal. It's just an insane plan, frankly. And as Ira mentioned, the most important, actively pursuing a verifiable agreement among nuclear armed states. We are actively working on that. We're proud to say that New Jersey is one state legislature that actually passed a resolution supporting these five points of Back from the Brink. We're one of, I believe, only 4 states in the union. We need more. We need to obviously let people know that these are horrible, insane, immoral weapons, and we have seen what they can do. We're commemorating the 75th anniversary of their use. It's only by pure luck that they haven't been used again, or an accident has exploded one. It's time that the existential threat be over the planet. And with that, I'll get back to some Q&A. Please, we'll be getting some emails out, as Nikki mentioned, to follow up on these action alerts, but we'll give you things to do. We'll give you people to talk to if you want to get involved more in the effort. And now back to some questions. Can you folks stay for a few minutes? I'm sorry, I didn't want to impose if you can't.
I can.
Okay.
I can for about 5 or 10, and then I have another commitment.
Okay. Judith Arnold asks, people who think about nuclear weapons probably have to be in denial in order to live with the knowledge of what those weapons can do. How do we overcome their denial and convince them and others who aren't aware of the dangers to act to get nations to denuclearize? And that kind of goes to what we were just talking about, working with them. But if either one of you would like to speak to that as well, we'd love to hear your input.
Well, I think that that's an incredibly important insight. There is an enormous amount of denial. As I was saying earlier, people literally cannot believe that this could actually happen. And we have to figure out somehow how to break through that. Now, in the 1980s, we did. We got to a situation where the vast majority of the population understood the danger of nuclear war, and millions of people were motivated to take action around it. Largely, it was simply a question of bringing the information to them, helping them understand the insanity of our nuclear policy, as Elaine has spoken about so eloquently, and helping them understand what the medical consequences are going to be if these weapons are used. And I think it's in some ways, it's simply a question of reaching a critical mass of understanding about this. One of the problems today is that when people hear about nuclear war, they may be very taken with the idea that they need to take action, but then they don't hear about it again for days or weeks or months. They don't see articles every day in the papers or hear about it on the radio or the TV as we did back in the 80s. And so the idea that there's a real problem here kind of fades in their mind, because obviously if things were really as bad as they were talking about on that webinar, everyone would be talking about it. So we have to create a situation where more and more people are talking about it. And that's frankly a lot of what the Back from the Brink campaign was designed to do, to create a vehicle that people could use to bring up this question, to go to their Rotary Club or to their church group or to their city council and say, we need to have a conversation about nuclear war. We want you to sign onto this statement. And so far, about 350 organizations and cities and states around the country have signed on, which is really exceeds what our expectations were when we launched the campaign. And we hope that that will grow dramatically over the next year, and that it will create this kind of rumble about nuclear war that enables people to think about it and to, draw the correct conclusion. This is not something they can afford to ignore.
Thank you. From Michelle Guttenberg, isn't nuclear waste and storage a threat as well? Also, the nuclear tests Russia and the US had done in their own backyard must have an impact on the ozone atmosphere as much as fluorocarbons. No discussion on permanent environmental damage so far. Can you speak to that for a moment? Either one of you?
I mean, one observer in Australia points out that global warming may destroy humanity and a great deal of the environment in 100 years, and nuclear weapons may do it in the next 100 minutes. So it certainly is something that is a huge has huge environmental impact. We know that the Marshall Islands, where 67 atomic weapons have been exploded, have been ruined for that population. We know that the testing in the United States, in New Mexico and Nevada, did disproportionate harm to Hispanic peoples and Native Americans. So yeah, the injuries in those ways are very real. And the fact that we don't have a way of storing the waste, as your question implies, is a huge problem. There are two films, one by Finland called Into Eternity, I think, that is about the huge underground tunnels they've had to build to store the spent nuclear fuel, not from weapons, but from reactors. And it's like a gigantic wound in the earth. I mean, I can't even begin to express the description of this. Then there's another film called Containment by Peter Gallison and Rob Moss that is about the problem of storage in our own country, that are both very fine films.
Thank you, Elaine. From an anonymous attendee, is there a popular social media campaign combined with the Madison Avenue campaign designed to call attention and educate the public? I will say that there's a number of organizations, ICAN being one, also PSR, and one I can't think of right now, that are very active on social media. I don't know of something any more organized than that with their social media on Facebook and Twitter. I don't know if either one of you do, but the interesting part of this question, in addition, has there been any effort to include this information in public school curriculums combined with a Civic 101 type class? Does anyone know of anything like that going on?
Not that I'm aware of currently. Again, there have been times when there were college curricula and medical school curricula designed to discuss the nuclear danger. But I don't believe that there is, at this point, an active effort to bring this into the schools. Elaine, are you aware of something that I don't know about?
I'm only aware that a group of physicists, including Max Tegmark and others in Mass Peace Action, are very concerned about the complete absence of nuclear weapons in the high school curriculum and the university curriculum. So yeah, the answer is it is a big problem.
Partly this is a question of resources, as is doing a good social media campaign. None of the organizations that are engaged in trying to change nuclear policy are particularly well funded, unfortunately. And I think all of us have identified that this kind of educational effort would be high on our list of things we would like to do if we were able to generate more resources to do it. Social media campaign, absolutely. I know PSR has a number of people who are trying to put together a new medical school curriculum that have not been able to come up with the resources to support that work yet. So it's a very, very good question because it speaks to a real need that we need to address.
Yeah,
And I'm sorry, go ahead, Elaine.
I was just going to say, it seems as though it really only comes about when individual students invite Ira or me or Nikki or Jeff to come there and lecture. And of course, that's a one-off event. So you give the lecture, and but it's not part of the curriculum. It's not got any reinforcing substance.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of great research going on at universities in New Jersey and elsewhere, up by you folks as well on the subject. But the curriculum is another story. and as Elaine said, NJIT had a great program last April, and our dear friend Bruce was there along with Elaine and a lot of other international scholars and subject matter experts. And we're trying to actually make that a more of an ongoing process than it actually became. And there's also something coming up next year, early in the year at Montclair State here in North Jersey, that we're talking about getting involved in, and I have to speak to Nikki as well about collaborating on. So there's some things, but nothing as regular as it probably should be. Ira, I know you've persevered here for us. If you have to leave, I certainly understand. Elaine, the same thing. I want to thank you both before you have to run out the door, so to speak, and click your end meeting button. Thank you again from myself and Nikki. I don't want to speak for Nikki, but I know I was thrilled to have you both. This has been a great night. To everyone still here, we'll stick around for a little while. I do have other questions. I will get them to via email to Ira and Elaine, and we'll see what we can do about getting them answered over the next few days. We'll also be getting emails out to everybody about the action items and a couple of more things that Coalition for Peace Action and New Jersey Peace Action are working on. So I just wanted to thank you. If you do have to run, I certainly understand. Thank you so much for being here tonight, though.
Jeff, thanks to you and Nikki for organizing this event. It was really great to be able to talk with people about these issues. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you very much, Ira.
Thank you both so much.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Elaine, you want to grab one more question while we have you?
Because it's much easier for me to answer orally if I know the answer than in email. So yeah.
You have excuse me. You've pointed out that a no first use policy undermines the entire system of nuclear weapons. If the sort of legislators that we have in the US understand that, how could they possibly accept such a policy?
I think that they are beginning to understand it, and that's why we have these various bills in the legislature. The Congress had a whole hearing about first use in 1974, I believe it was, and it was a hugely rich discussion, and the preposterousness of it was visible for all to see. Also, there was an attempt by two congressmen in 1989, and I had the pleasure and honor of being a tiny, tiny part of this case, where two congressmen, Ron Dellums and Ed Casey, took the unconstitutionality of it to the courts. And the judge, this was in the Ninth Circuit, that's known often for its kind of liberal views, the court turned down the case, saying it wasn't yet ripe for decision. And what he meant was not that we're not near enough to catastrophe, but that you needed more congressmen. But he did say this might be something that the Supreme Court will one day have to rule on. And I think that there are enough people in Congress that that case can, in addition to the legislation, it would be possible to mount a case in the courts that would require the dismantling of this system. And the arrangements for solitary use are so bound up with what a nuclear weapon is that if you can get rid of that, you can start to dismantle the whole nuclear architecture.
Right. What provisions, procedures do you think should be established before allowing for the launch of this is a question I'm not sure I want to ponder. What provisions, procedures do you think should be established before allowing for the launch of a nuclear weapon to prevent reckless use? Would you think Roger Fisher's proposal during the Cold War of storing nuclear codes within an innocent person a viable measure? I wasn't aware of that, so I'm not, yeah. Elaine, can you answer that?
I don't see how there could be any kind of launch that is acceptable. It absolutely isn't. And people say, well, you need it because the other countries want to use it. The other countries don't want to use it. The populations of the other countries are just like us. They don't want it. And for example, people will say to me, yeah, but North Korea is so crazy it might use it. North Korea went to the International Court of Justice in 1995 and pleaded with the court to have these things declared illegal, and said, that if they couldn't be declared illegal, they were going to have to get one. And again, North Korea, when this treaty started going through the UN, North Korea was the only nuclear country that came forward and supported it. And then when North Korea saw that no other country was supporting it, it backed off. But I'm just using that as an example of the fact that every country wants to get rid of these things. We're driving not only our own citizenry into poverty by spending money on these weapons, but we've harmed other countries by making them get new arsenals as well.
Yeah. To think that any launch of nuclear weapons is anything but reckless is a hard thing to fathom.
Yeah.
Um,
What could a country have done? What could a country possibly have done that would lead to its citizenry being killed? If the leader's done something bad, then the leaders of the two opposing countries can, go into an arena and inflict harm on one another if they choose to, if they both consent to that and want to, but leave the rest of the world out of this.
I agree. There are a number of other questions. I'm going to submit them to people. I'm going to let people go. We do try to stick with some kind of timeline. We've run over the last couple of times, but I do want to keep some semblance of organization here. Elaine, thank you again. Good seeing you. Thank you so much for all your work.
Oh, pleasure.
thanks to everybody at Mass Peace Action, all the great work you guys are doing up there. It's an inspiration to other folks in Peace Action all around the country. Nikki, great having you here. Thank you for all your help on putting this together. Thank you to all our attendees out there. I will submit these questions. Everyone on the registration list will be getting an email tomorrow or the next day with some follow-up steps, including what we talked about here, but also a couple of others that we didn't have time to speak about. Thank you so much, everybody. And let's get rid of these dang things once and for all. I'll tell you one reason that legislators don't listen enough is because there's not enough of us pushing on calling, making telephone calls and sending emails. So we create more people out in the streets talking about this kind of thing. We can actually have some effect on this. So thank you all again for being here. Have a great evening, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.